Perfect. And then, Graham, whenever you want to get started, I'll let you take it away first.
Well, we have a group tonight for our fourth speaker in the Healthy Oceans, Healthy Community series. And I see through the list of the names, a lot of us know each other. So we do say for the recording and stuff, turn off your video, and it lets Andrés, us focus on the speaker. But at the end, I think it's always really great if we can have some engaging conversations and ask a couple of questions. I feel good if we turn your video on. It gives us that whole human kind of experience. You can always put your questions in the chat box as we go. That's really good too. We can refer to them. But this is a place to have some dialogue and be engaging back and forth. I see a lot of people on the call have a very high level of interest in this topic. So that would be good. And as I mentioned before, we've all been coping with COVID. So it's great to be able to connect, even though it's virtually. For those who may not know, this is the Gibson's Marine Education Society that's putting this on. We operate the Nicholas Sontag Marine Education Center, which is a community aquarium inside the Gibson's Public Market. We're always open on the weekends for public viewing. We've got great staff. Jenny, who's on this call tonight, and Victoria lead tours on the weekend, and we have lots of great volunteers. Post-COVID, it will be more thriving, but right now you can book online. So I'll drop the webpage link into the chat box for those that want to sign up and come and visit. And that's pretty much about us. We're a charity society, so I'll also put links in there if you feel like donating. It always helps programs like this continue. Our society's vision is to support an educated community that actually cares for the ocean's health, which is why this Andrés talk tonight is right in the center of our bullseye. We accomplish our vision by engaging in conservation efforts, such as our Healthy Harbor project with the town of Gibsons, delivering K-12 education programs on the Sunshine Coast. We've got a great partnership with the local school district, and bringing community programs like this to you. And so we're just so excited. We really love sort of this, what I call like a adult education, right? Older people that might not be in formal school anymore, getting to reconnect and learning much more deeply about these complex social, environmental, and economic challenges that our society faces. And I'm really excited to hear from Andrés because he has such insight into these overlapping jurisdictions and how they work together. He's friends with Mary and Brian Natras. So now I'm going to ask the Natrases to make a formal introduction, and I'm going to mute myself and just hang out in the background.
Great.
Thanks so much, Graham. So tonight we're extremely fortunate to have a wonderful and a very learned speaker, and that's Andrés Cisneros-Montemayor from UBC. And Andrés received his doctorate in resource management and environmental studies at UBC, and then has gone on in his career and has now the deputy director of the Ocean Nexus program at UBC. And the Ocean Nexus program is involved in so many different aspects of the blue economy of our oceans, the health of the oceans, and our society's relationship to the water. So with no further noise from me, we're very fortunate to hear from Andrés, and thank you very much for being here tonight, Andrés.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be invited, and I would love to be over there in person. Things being what they are, this will definitely do for now, but I'm really looking forward to being able to visit you all over there as soon as we can. My kids aren't in bed yet, so you might hear some thumping or potentially yelling when it is time for bed. So sorry about that in advance. And yeah, so as Brian mentioned, I'm at UBC, we were chatting last night, him and I was saying, another thing that's really important to me is I'm from a fishing community myself in Mexico. Kind of close. It's called Guaymas. It's sort of about 4-hour drive south from Arizona. Actually, a lot of Canadians recently have sort of nested out there, mostly from BC and Manitoba. So, I'd heard a lot about BC before I came here, and I've been here for about 10 years, and it's been really, really fun to learn so much about this coast as well. And, I've been super lucky to be able to travel, pretty well all over and see a lot of different fishing communities and it's just really neat to see all those ties that you kind of grow up with and all those cultures, and be able to sort of link them in with all the academic work and the policy work that comes out of that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So,
Sorry, I'll just stop my share here. You should be good to go.
thanks. And should be able to see that, I hope. There we go. So yeah, a lot of the work that I've done, as I mentioned, I'm from a fishing community. A lot of my personal background is tied up in fisheries. Both of my folks were actually fisheries biologists where I grew up. And so, you know, for me, always being really interested in the ocean, I mean, what better way to grow up, right? Everyone I know is connected to fishing in some way or another. And when I came up to do my graduate work at EBC in economics, I started doing it and sort of looking at different ocean sectors than the one that I was familiar with, right? So I figured I knew, well, you never know enough about anything, but I figured I knew enough about fisheries that I wanted to focus my studies on other things, right? So the economics of ecotourism or blue carbon, all these different new sectors that are coming up online. And lucky for me, nowadays we have this new term called the blue economy that people are sort of using to encompass on a lot of those sectors. So it was kind of perfect timing for me coming out of it, because, you know, I feel like I had all those tools to be able to talk about all these things in ways that hopefully are going to be useful for the future oceans. And so, you know, the main message that I hope you sort of get away from this today is that a new and transformative blue economy, right? So the future of the oceans, it has to focus on social equity. You know, we often talk about these three overlapping sectors: the social, ecological, and economic. But as I'll show today, that social aspect of it is really what makes it a new approach, and that's really going to be what makes a difference in terms of getting away from business as usual. And so, if you've heard of oceans recently, and you know, if you're here at this talk, probably you're really interested in this subject. Unfortunately, a lot of what we hear about is bad news, right? We have issues with pollution, with bycatch, with climate change having different sorts of impacts all over the world, right? And so, you know, on this coast, you know, we all know about the different impacts of climate and many other things on local iconic populations of salmon, which sort of trickle down through the ecosystem into us and touch on a lot of different species, right? So these are issues that are shared all over the world, but every local place has very unique challenges associated with these things. And you can see that in an economic sense if you look at the sort of models that we use to get a handle on where species are moving or how they're changing the distributions after the impacts of climate change. So this is some work by a really good friend and colleague of mine, Vicky Lamb. And so what she showed is that if you only look at the changes in temperature of the ocean, right, and species moving around to sort of avoid those hotter temperatures that they don't like, 90% of countries, so 9 out of 10 countries, would experience declines in the value of their fisheries, right, because fish are moving away or just simply not able to live in some of these places anymore. And that's really, really important, obviously, from a commercial standpoint, an economic standpoint for our fisheries. But it's also really important at deeper levels, including human health and culture. This map shows the greener parts are places where there's a higher consumption per capita of fish by indigenous communities, right? And so, you know, obviously, you don't have to be part of an indigenous community to have a relationship with the ocean. But in these communities, those relationships are obviously very long-standing, and those historical practices of fish consumption are still really relevant today, right? So they consume really, really high amounts of seafood, which obviously is great and if you want to maintain traditions, but also comes with some challenges in terms of public health when you think about the pollutants that are now in a lot of these fish or marine mammals or whatever. That picture of that's a mahi-mahi or dorado where I'm from, and my dad actually sent me that, and look at the amount of garbage that was inside that fish just in its stomach, right? So these are back home you can't drink the water out of the tap, as you probably know, in Mexico. So a lot of these are the caps in the 20 liter jugs of water that you buy to drink at home. And so they actually look a lot like jellyfish when they're floating in the water. And so a lot of these fishes ingest a lot of these things, right? And so beyond a lot of these sort of economic and health aspects and impacts and challenges that we have in the ocean, are also a lot of conflicts, right, between different people. So you can talk about the fish wars that happen in the North Atlantic, or recently there's been a lot of attention on labor abuses that happen at sea. And these have often been linked to places where there are not a lot of opportunities for people in coastal communities, and B, there's a lot of pressure to sort of decrease labor costs and low oversight to the point that people can really abuse people and not pay them, or actually keep them as modern day slaves on some of these fishing vessels. And so if you notice, a lot of the cross-cutting themes about this link to equity, right? So, and the differences in the intensity of the impacts that we're feeling from climate change, or from overfishing, or from pollution, et cetera, around the world, right? Because not everyone is affected in the same way. And there's been a lot more recognition towards this, and some really interesting sort of new work looking specifically, for example, at the social inequality impacts of climate change, right? So now not only at the models that we often see where we're projecting changes in temperature, and obviously the associated impacts of that on human populations, but really looking specifically at who are the people that are impacted by this, who are the people that are most vulnerable. In a similar way, there's been a lot of attention now on the role of women in particular in fisheries and in other coastal sectors worldwide, because their contributions are often just not counted. They're not taken into account when we're designing policies. And even in some of the emerging sectors like bioprospecting, which has been around for a while, but the focus on genetic material is pretty recent. And it's really one of the big sort of sources of interest in a future blue economy. We already see that one company around the world owns 50% of all genetic patents associated to marine genetic materials, right? And so already we see some crazy consolidation here. And sort of it's an open question of how we're actually going to share these resources, which are the benefit of everyone, right? Genetic materials are for all of humanity. How we're going to share them more equally. And so out of all of that, crazy, hopefully not too depressing suite of challenges, the blue economy came out of, right? And so a lot of you might be familiar with the green economy. And so this was proposed at Rio in '92, and then the first green economy report came out in Rio +20, so 20 years after that. And so the green economy is sort of that vision that we have of a more sustainable economy, right? An economy where you reduce emissions, what we often hear about today, right? So we want sectors that are not contributing to climate change, not contributing to pollution, but still contributing a lot of jobs around the world, and food, which is one of the big focuses of green economy. And so even at Rio +20, the small island developing states, which are it's sort of like a formal group of countries at the UN, and it's a lot of small island nations. A lot of them are in the South Pacific, a few in the Caribbean, and are sort of on the low income scale of developing countries. They sort of proposed this parallel term of blue economy, right? So they said we like this vision of a green economy. We can't do large scale agriculture or land-based marine renewable energy projects in our countries because we don't have a lot of land area, but we have a lot of ocean area. We're coastal, we're fundamentally oceanic countries. And so we're proposing this blue economy approach that is very, very similar, but it also adds a component of culturally appropriate development goals, right? Because for them, again, being island countries, they saw themselves as being a little bit distinct, maybe from sort of the larger global economy, just by virtue of having those close relationships with oceans. And so, as you see, this concept or term rather is fairly new and really was kind of cemented at the UN Oceans Conference in 2017 in New York. And the very first Blue Economy Conference happened a year later in Kenya, And I was lucky enough to be there, and there were 18,000 people there, 18,000 people at the very first conference of this new term that only came online a few years prior, right? So you can see there's a massive amount of interest in what the oceans can bring, right? What the oceans are going to look like. But so one really interesting part of a lot of what my research has done is, how exactly, there's a lot of different types of visions, right? So what exactly do we mean by blue economy? And depending on what we mean, how are we going to actually achieve those policies that bring benefits to local people? And so this is from some work from colleagues, Michelle Voyer and Jan Silver, and they actually kind of distilled that in a really neat way. So they went to a lot of the different sessions at this Oceans conference in New York, and I don't, there were dozens of sessions, sort of little mini speaking sessions there. And so they came out with a few very distinct, interesting discourses that people were talking about, right? So different ways in which people were talking about the same term, blue economy, right? And so based on this, right now it seems that when a lot of people talk about it, they mean blue economy is oceans as natural capital, right? So the resources themselves, if we make them sustainable, they are, essentially an asset that we have and that we can use to create jobs and economic returns. And next to them are some of the sort of organizations that are very much taking these approaches to blue economy, these interpretations of it. But another one is oceans as livelihoods, right? So the oceans are this place where people find occupation and food, right? And just basic income. Another one is oceans as drivers of innovation. Not a lot of surprise, a lot of the industry groups are very interested in this, right? So the oceans are this new frontier for new technological development, new types of sectors, new types of investments that can pay off. And finally, oceans as good business, which is somewhat related, but this is kind of a narrative that's taken a little bit more in terms of creating the conditions for better business environment, right? So a lot of it is, how are we going to parcel out the ocean? How do we better define property rights around ocean resources, right? Who owns what? How do I know where my ocean resources start and where yours start and end? And so it's a little bit of a different bent, but still very much on the economic growth side of the arguments. And so one interesting thing about this is that we're not only talking semantics, right? As you can see, a lot of these organizations are really quite large, right? Whether they're NGOs or the UN bodies or, World Ocean Council, which is sort of an industry lobby group that brings together a lot of different sectors all over the world. OECD are these massive intergovernmental organizations. And so the narrative that they bring really matters to what actually happens on the ground. So to give you an example, if we think about industries that have really high growth potential, economic growth potential, and are sustainable, you would think about marine renewables, right? Offshore energy. We should definitely include something like that. Are those jobs going to local communities? That's more of an open question, but that may not be what you're focusing on, right? If you take this approach. Conversely, if you're thinking about currently very high profits, and you're not too concerned with it being sustainable, at least not in the short term, then you would think about offshore oil and gas, right? This is by far the largest contributor to the ocean economy, even if it is, by definition unsustainable, or these are non-renewable resources. Or to take it sort of a very different tack, if you think about resources that are really important for livelihoods, like artisanal fisheries, they could be sustainable, but they have probably a very low potential for growth, right? There's already a lot of people working here. It'll take us a lot of efforts to make them sustainable, and it's unclear how much more they're going to grow beyond that, right? These are already very mature industries. And so in some of these plans that people have, including in some of the European ones for blue economy, artisanal fisheries, for example, aren't included as part of the future of the ocean that they envision, right? They just don't see it as something that has high growth potential, and that's what they're focusing on, right? And so when you see sort of this kind of image that's very common when people talk about blue economy, or it's sort of a very high-tech image, and very much about marine spatial planning, where you put your mariculture farms, where you put your wind farms and your drilling sites, et cetera. One big question or one big thing that I see missing from there is the people aspect, right? So where are the local communities in this? Are they contributing to these industries? Are they benefiting from them? Are they being impacted by them? And I think that's a really, really important thing that we have to think about, right? And that's why I often talk about the blue economy as being a transformative approach. Why transformative? Because when we think about the future oceans, we can't think of the oceans as a blank slate. This figure sort of shows places where ocean sectors already happen, right? So all the yellow are places that have high tourism arrivals, sort of marine tourism. The blue shading are fisheries. There's some other sort of pink shading for mariculture sites. The different icons are blue carbon, so different mangrove or salt marsh restoration sites, wind and tidal energy sites, bioprospecting sites. And basically what you see is there's a massive amount of activity already happening in the ocean. And so again, when we think about blue economy, the challenge isn't really going to be, coming up with new sectors and sort of building them and implementing in a way that is equitable and sustainable. The real challenge is how do we transform these sectors that are already there, right? They've already been working. They already have a lot of people that are employed in them. And we need to actually transform them into sectors that are equitable and sustainable. And, as we saw before, obviously a lot of these sectors already come with a lot of issues that we need to tackle right away. So it's not like we're starting from, achieving equity and sustainability aren't our only immediate concerns, right? We already know about the global impacts of the shipping industry in terms of invasive species, of pollution, and increasingly of the social impacts of some of these sectors, right? So, we have to worry about now if our shrimp is being produced by slave labor. These are things that we didn't do before, but there's more than enough evidence now to show us that these social issues are the ones that we really should be thinking hard about. And so again, that's where I'm coming from then, with the fact that social equity has to be the focus of that new and transformative blue economy. And so what do we mean when we talk about social equity and this blue economy and putting everything together? So often we talk about natural resources, and I'm going to show you a little bit of some new work that is actually in press. So it's not out yet, but it's going to come out in the journal Nature, I think in a few weeks probably. So you're some of the first to see it. I'm really excited that it got through and to share this. So we essentially think about 4 different dimensions when we try to estimate capacity for blue economy, right? And so again, when I talk about capacity for blue economy, I'm thinking the capacity to establish ocean sectors in a way that's socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable. So the first thing that most people think about are the natural resources, right? So do you have the wind to put a wind farm? Do you have the right oceanographic conditions to put in aquaculture farms? Do you have fish for fisheries or for ecotourism, et cetera, right? And then when we talk about social equity, that's a massive subject, but in very, very sort of nutshell terms, we often are talking about recognition, right? So we have to recognize the people that are being impacted by these activities, right? So that will be benefit or be negatively impacted by them. We need to include them in the decision-making process all throughout. And we need to make sure that we take into account in the distribution of the benefits and costs of ocean sectors, right? And so I'm more than happy to just chat about this more during the questions. Environmental sustainability, we again, sustainability is one of these massively loaded terms, and there's books written about what sustainability means. In oceans, often when we talk about sustainability, we usually are thinking about sort of impacts on species specifically, so species populations or abundances, or the state of habitats, so the physical habitat, or ecosystems as a whole, right? So the functioning of an entire ecosystem. And that's actually really important. That's sort of a little bit more recent that we think about an ecosystem approach, but I think it's really, really important in this case, especially if we're taking a broader view of our impacts on the environment and on oceans. And then finally, economic growth, right? So this is sort of the one you have to work the least to convince the policymakers on. But there are some ins and outs to it, right? So are you talking about private growth, so private investments, or public investments that you're hoping to pay off maybe a little bit further down the line, or in different ways, right? So are you only looking for, because again, economics is not only about finance, right? So you're looking for financial profits or other types of economic benefits for a community or for a country. And so for this particular work, we actually only focused on 6 ocean sectors that are the most commonly talked about when you talk about blue economy, right? And so one would be blue carbon. So this is when you essentially, this links actually to carbon credits and forestry that some of you might be familiar with. So essentially you take care of a stand of trees or a forest, and you calculate how much carbon is sequestered by this stand that you have that you're protecting, and then that is sold on a carbon market, right? So essentially you're paying to offset, or rather companies that are producing emissions are paying for conservation in order to offset some of their emissions, right? And so blue carbon in the ocean is starting out, and there's already a lot of interest in it, right? And so the usual systems that they focus on are mangroves, which we don't have any in Canada, unfortunately. There's more in Mexico where I'm from. But we do have a lot of salt marshes, right? Seagrass beds, and kelp forests, right? So, well, other types of algae, but kelp forest is usually one of the ones that's the most talked about. So blue carbon, fisheries, so artisanal industrial fisheries, ecotourism, and this can be, scuba diving, snorkeling, whale watching, any sorts of things. Mariculture, bioprospecting, and ocean renewable energy, right? So this can be wind farms or tidal or wave energy, and this is also really, really ramping up quite quickly, but it's still in the early stages, right? So they're still working a lot of these technologies out. And so how do we measure it? I'm not going to go too deep into the methods, but essentially I'm really, really lucky to work with a very large network of people that are really interdisciplinary. And so I'll go back actually a little bit. And so when we talk about, where are these marine living resources? So where's the wind? Where are the fish? Where are the mangroves or the seagrass beds? How are sort of local governance and infrastructure conditions related to equity or to economic growth? What's the state of local habitats, ecosystems? I'm lucky to have access to a lot of that data through our networks, right? And so we're essentially able to integrate all that into a model where we sort of overlay a lot of these different layers, really interdisciplinary data, to be able to measure that capacity in a very, very multifaceted approach, right? So we take it into account all of those different aspects that I talked about. And so really the 2 key takeaways from it are these. One is that and this is really interesting. Well, at least for me, I hope it's interesting for you as well. But the main challenges for establishing a blue economy, right? So the differences between capacity when you look across the world are not really in resources, right? So most places have enough resources to do at least 1 or 2 or 3 of these ocean sectors, right? Sometimes more. The challenges are related to these to the distribution of the benefits, right? That's where the capacity gets a little bit lost. Right, and so the challenge in order to establish a blue economy is going to be making sure that those local communities are benefiting, right? So do you have the governance capacity, if you will, in place to make sure that the jobs go to local people, or that local people are unduly impacted and that they're benefiting from these things and they're being taken into account? The second big takeaway from this is that not every place is able to develop every ocean sector, right? So that classic image that I showed you of the mariculture farms and the bioprospecting and the fisheries and the tourism and every other sector you can think of sort of coexisting in one place, it is probably unrealistic, right? So that's not to say that you can't have multiple sectors, but it's going to be very, very hard to make them all coexist in the same place at the same time, right? And if any of you've done any sort of like urban planning or any sort of these sort of things, this is a very common challenge. And so I don't see it as a negative, really. I see it as a positive, because what it means is that we have to think even more carefully and really involve these local communities in choosing the sectors that make the most sense in a given place, right? So we need to think carefully and really hard about what we want as a community to build locally, right? What makes the most sense in this particular context? And so how do we get there? Well, I'll start kind of from the high level, but I'll definitely move into the local stuff. One sort of encouraging thing that I see is that at the high level, quote unquote, in terms of policy making, right? So the multilateral agreements and this sort of thing, we're already seeing a lot more recognition that prioritizing equity and social well-being is a real goal, right? It is a real goal that we should be thinking about just as much as sort of pure economic growth. You know, there's a recent, I think it was 14 countries that participated in this high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. And you look at this up online, everything's free to download. There are a lot of cool videos and stuff. And I was lucky to be invited to a couple of the reports that actually focused on things that were not only economic growth, right? So I'm an economist, and I was asked to actually review some of the economic growth things, but also be able to be a part of some of these reports that really are arguing that social well-being needs to be at the core of this thing. You know, same sort of things that I've been arguing all along, led by social scientists. You know, so to have sort of a multilateral panel of countries whose sort of vision is to create a template for a future ocean economy, and to have the foresight to include as part of those big, you know, reports and big efforts, specific ones focusing on how we're going to ensure that social equity is a part of it, I think is a big step forward. You know, it really says a lot to where we're getting in terms of that recognition. Now, I don't want to pretend everything's rosy. You know, I wish I could. There's a really nice saying in Spanish, but I can't think of an English. Anyway, basically the saying is from talking to doing, there's a big gap, right? And so I think we're still going to see if they really mean a lot of the stuff that they're prioritizing. And I'm happy to chat more about that as well during the questions. Another thing that's really important too at that high level is that we start to change that narrative of transformation, right? So transformation is not something that's inherently bad. You know, often people, you know, change is seen with a lot of reticence or a lot of skepticism, right? But in this case, you know, we have all of these significant challenges that we already talked about. You know, we should be embracing change a little bit more, and should be saying, how do we change a lot of these things? Because business as usual isn't working environmentally and socially and economically, actually, if you think about a lot of local scales, right? And so I often go back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so one really key piece of text in there is no one must be left behind, right? That's the overall vision. And I think if we really take that to heart, you know, that means we have to be thinking about local communities, vulnerable populations. We have to be thinking about how to include them in the stuff that we're doing. And so I think that is something really important that we also starting to see more and more of on that international stage. But of course, local efforts are really essential. You know, and so all over the world, we're starting to see these sorts of efforts pop up, specifically kind of giving us examples of how we might be able to you know, include more people, recognize them, think more carefully about distribution of benefits and costs. And so, you know, we see it in a lot of these different councils, regional councils, including in Canada with the Arctic Council, for example, having specific seats mandated for Indigenous communities that are living there, right? Which historically it was more of a sort of a pure science-led approach where, you know, Western science and Western methods sort of led the charge, and, you know, maybe you ask for people on their opinion or something. But now there's been a real change and a real desire to actually include that local knowledge, both in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, that local knowledge and those lived experiences of people that have been there for a long time, and could really, you know, tell us a lot about what's going on in these sorts of places and how we should best design the policies. We also see it in a lot of ecotourism ventures around the world, where people are designing tourism that's locally appropriate, right? And so slowly getting a little bit away from that mass tourism model that was really common before in you know, especially around coastal areas, including where I'm from, getting more to that sort of smaller scale and sort of catering to people that want to go to these places not only to stay at a resort, there's nothing wrong with that, but also wanted to stay in communities that are where they're able to see more of the local culture, more of that local ecosystem. This picture I love. Actually, a good friend of mine took this one. It's called David versus Goliath, the picture itself. And there's a place called Cabo Pulmo in the Gulf of California, sort of maybe hour and a half-ish drive north of Cabo. And that's one community that's really neat because this is a small fishing community, and sort of the younger generation of fishers kind of convinced their parents and their uncles that were there that maybe they should really tap into this ecotourism thing. And so they really fought hard to put a marine protected area there, just in front of their small community. And it's been an unbelievable rebounding in local fish populations, right? And so I'm from that area, and I'd never seen fish like that ever, growing up snorkeling and scuba diving. And it's all because of this, this concerted effort by a local community that, yes, now it's being recognized all over the place, but it started really locally, and it started with that vision of what was appropriate for them. So you start to see this all over the world. In some of the larger corporations, the large seafood companies, you see it more and more with their eco-labeling campaigns, where sort of they're recognizing that consumers have a huge part to play in this, and they care about seeing first it was only about sustainability. Now a lot of it has to do with sort of socially responsible seafood production, and that's really encouraging. Now around this coast, one thing that's really cool is when we start to zoom out a little bit, we realize that a lot of the species that we have around here mean so much to local peoples, right? So indigenous and non-indigenous, they're really iconic. The salmon and the different birds and marine mammal species that are here, but they also connect all across the ocean, right? So in this map, what you can see is these little lines are actually tagging data. They're little tracks from different animals that they tagged. These kind of purpley pink ones are from albatrosses. These ones here are from fur seals, northern fur seals. These ones are from sea turtles. These ones here are from sockeye salmon. And all the little black points there are spots where there are current indigenous communities, right? So indigenous peoples living there. And one really interesting thing has been how that local knowledge really represents knowledge that cuts across all oceans, right? So it's not only local knowledge, it's knowledge that's relevant across scales. And something that we've been really trying to work hard at is showing this kind of map to policymakers that are working, for example, on how to govern the high seas, right? So all these areas that are outside of any particular country's waters, and saying, hey, listen, even if local communities aren't out there fishing on the high seas, they have a lot to show us about how to manage these species, right? And the cultural values and the benefits that a lot of these species bring along the coast. And so when we think local, we also have to think about how all the locals are connected, right? Another thing is, as I mentioned before, this taking the ecosystem approach. I love this figure. This actually was drawn by the daughter of a colleague of mine from SFU, and she's amazing. I think she's like 16 or something when she drew this. And I love this because this is from a paper that he wrote. This is from Jose Alaba, and he wrote this really cool paper on sort of the function of ecosystems in providing sort of healthy seafood for us, right, in healthy environments. And what I thought was really cool about it was that it shows all these different components that all have a role to play in that kind of filtration system and pollutant absorption system that is the ocean, right? So it's not only about, you might have heard that the oceans absorb a lot of the excess heat that's created by climate change, which is definitely true, but it's not only that. Kelp forests, as I mentioned, absorb CO2 and seagrass beds. Clams and mussel beds filtrate all the water that's coming through there. Whales and other marine mammals, actually, from the intake, when things come out, they fertilize a lot of the seaweeds and other animals that are there with iron. And even at the bottom, right? So when we think about crabs and sea cucumbers, anemones that are at the bottom, and they're actually some of the really cool things to see if you've ever gone diving off this coast, they have an enormous role to play cleaning out the detritus and the stuff that's falling, right? So that whole ecosystem, when we think about the benefits that it brings us in terms of livelihoods and culture and health and climate, it's really everything, right? It's a whole functioning that is sustaining us, right? It's not just one species, even if species are certainly iconic. And so finally, this is almost to end up, I think one really important thing to take away from this when we think about our own communities is thinking about how are we going to make sort of a just and fair transition to a blue economy. And so I think a lot about this coast. As you can well imagine, this coast looks a lot different from the one that I grew up in. But I often think of the parallels there, where you start with this very resource intensive coastline, right? So fishing and logging, mining, et cetera. And slowly but surely you start transitioning to different sectors. When we talk about the ocean, we've talked about farming finfish or oysters, the scuba diving and tourism industries. And now on this coast, obviously a lot on this sort of coastal development, and real estate development, which is a huge driver of the economy. And I don't see anything inherently wrong with any of those things, but the important thing is, how do we make sure that as we're doing that transition, we're not leaving our local communities behind, right? And we're making sure that they're leading the way into the types of developments that they would like to see and are appropriate to their own context. And so I'll finish up there. If you notice, I kind of came full circle, and hopefully now, when I say that a new and transformative blue economy has to focus on social equity, you sort of have a much better idea of why I'm sort of saying that. It's something that I think is backed up by a lot of the evidence that we see. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I'd love any questions. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll leave my camera back on there. That was awesome. So I think that we will provide some time just for folks to write some questions in the chat. There may have been some along the way. I'll just take a look in. And then Andres, if you feel comfortable reading them out of the chat and just answering them that way, that works well for us.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Yeah, so we have one from Errol. Thanks so much for the question. So how might the Sunshine Coast and Gibsons in particular benefit from establishing a blue economy? So I'm going to give an answer that I think, but really my answer would be that would be something for you guys to decide locally, right? From what I was saying, I mean, Gibsons much better than I do, but I think really the main thing that I would say is sort of in two different ways. One is related to the process of establishing a blue economy, and the other one is more specific to the sectors, right? So, the sectors we might talk about, obviously tourism is really booming in that area, and real estate, and so in those types of sectors, really the important thing to think about is how do you develop them in a way that from the beginning is equitable and sustainable, right? It's because once they get really big, it's really tough to scale things back, right? And so you want to make very sure that as we're developing these things, tourism, for example, you might want to be thinking about stuff sort of lower impact tourism, ecotourism, scuba diving. This coast is amazing for diving and snorkeling, all these sorts of things, kayaking and wildlife watching. And so those types of initiatives I think could be really important. Another thing, I know fisheries obviously aren't the industry they used to be in Gibsons, but I think there is a lot of interest now, especially if there's a lot more consciousness about eating local, for example, in which those types of sectors can be prioritized, but again, in more of an artisanal way. So it's kind of going a little bit back to our roots and sort of prioritizing and supporting people that are trying to get into fisheries now. It's so difficult to get into fisheries now in BC just because the license costs are so incredibly high, right? But there's nothing to prevent us from changing some of the policies that we use and making sure that we're sort of prioritizing younger people that are actually living in the communities from getting access to those fishing opportunities. But so those are some thoughts more on the outcomes. In terms of the process, though, again, the process of establishing a blue economy can be something that's really useful for a community, right? Because if you think about it, if blue economy is about, recognition and inclusion and participation and distribution, achieving all those things by default means that you have to connect with your community, and how you do it. Well, pandemic is a bit tough, I guess, Zoom, but normally, you do it by coming together as a community, right? And so that can, the Marine Center is actually a perfect place. You can have these places that can serve as sort of little hubs that can get people talking about these sorts of things, right? And I think that process is so incredibly important. And actually, not to get too academic wonky here or anything, but there's so much research to show that if people are happy with the process that was undertaken to get somewhere, they're usually happy with the outcome, kind of regardless of what the outcome really was. You know what I mean? And so I think there's really something to be said for that, and to really value that process of getting there. Okay, I'm just coming down the list here. Okay, so there's a question from Nicholas Andrews. Hi, Nicholas. How would the blue economy benefit island states who are currently unable to develop industries due to climate change impacts or general lack of capacity or money, but have large exclusive economic zones, for example, Tuvalu or Kiribati? So there's sort of several ways, right? So a lot of and kind of the small and developing states are taking two different tacks on this. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but I've seen sort of two different strategies, right? So one is to kind of really embrace the local independence aspect and right of getting more of a handle on what the resources are. So whether that's renewable energy and saying, hey, listen, we can do these renewable energy sites here, and show aid agencies that they're taking the lead on this, and then they need some support for these sort of investments, right, that are larger scale. That's kind of on the newer side. Or for example, bioprospecting, there's a lot of interest in really delineating exactly where their areas are, so that if anybody's interested in seabed mining or doing whatever there, they know for sure that this is our area, so you need to come talk to us first, right? And so the other way is to try to negotiate a little bit more fair deals from industries they already have. So one industry that a lot of small island states benefit from is tuna fishing or high seas fishing, right? So a lot of them have these fishing access agreements where there's a long history of this, but essentially most of these small island states don't have their own fishing fleets, right? And it's more of the larger European fleets or Asian fleets that are fishing there. And so they pay a fee in order to fish inside these countries' waters, right? And so now there's more and more of a push by these countries to say, hey, listen, we've been getting a pretty raw deal here historically. Like, we want more of a share over the money that you're getting from these different fees, right? And so it's kind of both things, right? So make sure that when they're starting the new sectors, they're being able to lead them. And the other is renegotiating things so that the existing sectors are getting more out of them. And I don't want to say that they're all this sort of like heterogeneous things, because a lot of different countries have very specific ideas of how they want to do it. But those are sort of the strategies that I've seen mostly reflected there. It's a question from Colin Stansfield. Hi, Colin. How does a just and equitable blue economy show up in federal policy? With nearly $1 billion committed to Canada's ocean supercluster, that strategy seems more exclusively focused on innovation and economic growth. Colin, you're preaching to the choir here. I just saw this stuff come in and I was like, oh, and you know what? And there's other examples of this. So for example, I've seen just like so much attention, not just in Canada, but also in Canada, on the Arctic as this like new source of like shipping lanes, and this, maybe we're gonna drill there and like start new fisheries. And I'm like, no, like the Arctic melting isn't something exciting. This is really bad. There's people who like live there. There's like entire cultures that depend on this thing. Like, and so I understand that, part of federal government's job obviously is to look for new opportunities for economic growth. But I do think that, how can I say this? I've been a little bit disappointed given Canada's public discourse on being a climate leader and sort of a leader. And quite frankly, me as a non-Canadian, Canada has the capacity to set an enormously positive example for the rest of the world. And so I hope there's no Americans here, but Canada is not the US in terms of its standing among the rest of the countries, right? So there's really a lot that Canada to do to push a lot of these sort of new and transformative initiatives. And so I do think that it should really take advantage of that. So I think there's a lot more opportunity to do this. But yeah, how does it show up? I think there's a lot more work to be done there for sure. I will say, I know that the sort of the blue economy plan that DFO is putting together is only just coming together. So I don't want to be too harsh yet. I do want to believe that there's still time to sort of get it into a better place. I know of a few colleagues that have been sort of participating in it, and they're people that I really respect a lot and that I know are bringing up a lot of these things. And so I'm hopeful, let's say that, well, it's hard to know exactly when these things happen, right? Especially right now, but I'm hopeful that in the next, whatever, months or year that they're coming out with this new plan, we'll see a lot more of these things reflected. And so yeah. So there's a question here from Pam Robertson. Hi, Pam. Have you seen great examples of community dialogue and debate that result in alignment around a path forward? Like in Canada or like in general? In Canada? Yeah, actually, I mean, I think specifically to oceans, there's been some really, really interesting cases that I've seen, especially in BC, especially around Indigenous communities and their rights over fishing access. So we've heard folks up in Haida Gwaii or in Bella Coola, the Heiltsuk Nation. I believe there's another nation there. I apologize, I'm forgetting, but I know it's one aside from the Heiltsuk. And they've really done really interesting work in sort of like, first of all, really asserting their rights that they're given by law, which are not, this is not only something that Indigenous peoples can do, right? A lot of communities have some rights over their local ecosystems and lands and stuff, right? And so really coalescing and getting a handle of what exactly they can do and taking the lead and actually bypassing what they see as some of the challenges, right? So in the example of the Heiltsuk and the herring fishery, which was the most recent case, they saw the federal government as having maybe put in too lax of a fishing management quota for the herring that they thought should be a lot stricter. And they actually went straight to industry, right? And said, hey, can we work at a deal with you guys in order to prevent overfishing here? Which is really, really interesting, right? Because often you see those things totally at odds, right? And so that I thought was really interesting. And to answer your question, in my understanding, because I haven't worked on this personally, but I know people who have, it really came out of that community dialogue. So what we often hear about is sort of that last step, where they take the people to court and they gain their rights and whatever. It's like, oh, it looks easy, but this is actually years and years and years of the community getting together and actually deciding as a community what they wanted that step to be. And so I thought that's really, really interesting. And that's something that that's one example that I could give for sure. And I think it's something that hopefully we're going to start to see a lot more of as people sort of recognize that local communities matter a lot. That's all the questions I see for now. I don't know if Victoria, you want to.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Do we have any last minute questions? Oh, Valerie just put one in the chat for you.
Hi Valerie. This is from Valerie Durant. Valerie, I see you there. Are you aware if there is recent work being done to regulate the cruise ship industry, cruise ships, when it starts up again, and the effects of their practice of dumping within Canadian water? My understanding is that the US actually has stronger regulatory practices in this regard. So I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the actual Canadian regulations are specifically for cruise ships. I do know that the cruise ship industry has been an incredible contributor to invasive species over the years. I know they've been trying to get more of a handle on it now. And one really interesting thing that I've seen now actually in the Caribbean, where cruise ships are a huge part of a lot of local economies, is a lot more pushback against sort of what the benefits and the costs are of these cruise ships, right? So I think essentially they've been recognizing that a lot of those benefits from the cruise ships, you know, they dock at a dock that's owned by the same company, and these are the people selling the souvenirs or people that are part of the same companies, and there's really not a lot of benefits going to the outside community. And so I know there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of rethinking about what the cruise ship industry could be. And what's interesting also is that, I mean, again, they're kind of sort of asserting the fact that the cruise ship is there to see them, right? So they are the attraction. And so if the cruise ship wants to land on this beautiful Caribbean island, you're going to have to sort of renegotiate the share of benefits that we're getting from it. You know, there's that recognition that we have more power to do this. And so in terms of the dumping in Canadian waters, I don't know what the regulations are, to be perfectly honest, but I'm happy to follow up and I'll get back to you because I do have some people that work on that. And I'd actually be interested. I mean, you see them here well, I guess not for the last little bit, but you normally see them here all the time. And yeah, I mean, I remember actually, this is not exactly a cruise ship, but I talked to this guy who worked on one of the big Navy ships from the US, right? And so huge, enormous ships. And I was asking, hey, so what do you do with all the garbage? Like the garbage and because there's, I don't know, thousands of soldiers on these ships. And I thought they had some, bulk or storage that they were carrying. And no, they just dump them out to sea anywhere, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we need to just really stop, and so that idea that the ocean is just this, dump it and forget kind of thing, and it's gonna just have our waste and be fine, is something that is just so outdated as to just be completely unacceptable, I think, at this point. So I'm gonna look up on the cruise ships. I'm gonna write that down right now. Actually, I don't know how to get your email, but I'll send it to Victoria and Graham, and they'll get it to you. So yeah. But it's those kinds of things, right? And this is what I mean with the blue economy, because one thing is a big transformational stuff, but then there's all the other little stuff around the edges, or all these little things of, cruise ships or just ships in general, right? All the cargo ships dumping ballast and this sort of thing, which they've been trying to get a handle on for years and years and years. The big fishing boats going inside of marine protected areas. I don't know if you guys have heard of this initiative called Global Fishing Watch. If you Google Global Fishing Watch, there's a new initiative. So basically, any ship above 25 meters has to have a AIS on board. It's basically a little GPS thing that sends out a ping, and that's so ships avoid basically smashing into each other into a port when they're out at sea, or for safety, if anybody goes down, they know where the last location was. So Google actually, I don't know how they get away with this, but I guess it's Google. Google, those pings go through their satellites. And so they took all this information, which I guess once it goes into space is public or something. And they've actually mapped out all the different fishing boats in the world, and you can look at them in real time. And so people are actually using this sort of technology. Again, this stuff around the edges, right? To prevent some of these big ships from going into marine protected areas. This is something that also the small island states are doing because they don't have the money to go out and persecute vessels that are fishing without a permit, without an access agreement. Now they can look at them and say, hey, we need to get a handle on this. So this is one other thing that's where the technology does come in, right? And so, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit. This is really exciting. There's another question here. I'm not sure if it's from Valerie or maybe from Graham. What role do you see natural or eco asset valuation and management playing in guiding policies and decisions around marine resource development and extraction? For example, the economic value filtration provided by glass sponge reefs. So as an economist, there's a ton of value in that. We do have to be a little bit careful though, because it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, we can't keep pretending like all the stuff that the ocean gives us, we can just take it for granted, right? If we didn't have these sponges, if we didn't have these mangroves to protect against storms, if we didn't have these reefs or these mussels or whatever to filter our waters, we would have to be paying for that. There's a real economic value that's estimable in a lot of these different things, right? So there's a huge value in doing it. I've done a lot of it throughout my career. The double-edged sword, though, is that we do want to be careful about assigning value to things because once they enter the market, then someone can say, all right, fine, I'll pay you however much money you said your sponges were worth, and now let me go over them, right? So we need to make sure that in assigning them that value, which is very important, we also make really clear that some of these things, we're assigning the equivalent value if we had to do them, but they're still invaluable, if that makes sense, right? So we don't want these things traded in markets. It's just a way to get a better handle of what the economic benefit is to us, right? And so I think that part is really, really important. We have to make sure not to lose sight of the two at the same time, right? Because some of the benefits that they have, we won't be able to value. You know, the value of having a clean ocean that you can look out at is invaluable to me, but I'm sure someone can come up with a way to, you know, pay you to have a dirty ocean, and it would somehow be enough, right? And so we do need to be careful when we talk about economic values there. But again, I do want to stress that it is incredibly valuable there's not another word. It's pretty valuable to value some of these things economically, right? You do get ahead. They do help you with policymakers. And yeah, you just need to make sure that they understand that just because you're assigning this dollar tag doesn't mean that that's all that it's worth.
Yeah, the metaphor I've heard is like, you know, when someone applies for a job, you can you can give them a salary based on the skills that they have to offer, the services that they deliver, but them as a human are invaluable. So the glass sponge reefs are invaluable. One service they provide is filtration, another's habitat, another is, you know, a silica sink, whatever it is, right? And when you look at this service that's providing the specific value that you want in terms of the way you're looking at the problem, I just sort of was thinking about, because the town of Gibson's has their eco-asset strategy, and Cedar, who's on this call, has worked a lot on that modeling as well. When you're making decisions about what's more important, the glass sponge reefs or the salmon or the prawns, or like the answer is all of them.
Right, exactly. That's that whole ecosystem approach, right? Exactly.
Right, and it's always, I'm just wondering, like, because you're plugged into, you know, a lot of things that I'm not privy to, if you've seen that the actual natural asset valuation model being rolled out into assessments of marine spaces, and how that, and you've highlighted one risk, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. So for example, actually, if you go to that high level panel website, one of they're called blue papers, the series of reports that they have. So one of the blue papers that they have is exactly on that. So they sort of, they value the ocean economy if you were able to do it all sustainably and focus on these renewables and stuff. And I think it's at, it's economics, so pretty wide range, but I think it's between 8 and 20 trillion, which is huge, right? And so one number that I remember from it, I think they estimate that for every dollar you spend on the ocean and making it sustainable, you gain at least $5 back in terms of your investment, right? Which is obviously like an enormous rate of return or whatever. And so as an economist, I can say I don't put a whole lot of stock in like the big numbers because there's always uncertainty or whatever. But I think the exercise of it is important, right? Because essentially what they're doing is saying, hey, listen, this is not trivial stuff, you know. And actually, the narrative, if you talk to folks in the World Bank, they have a whole section now in blue economy, is that the oceans are going to be what leads global economic growth in the future, you know. So that's kind of what they're betting on, you know. And so I think that really says a lot when you see these sorts of reports out there. And so again, I think just the important thing is that we not lose sight that the oceans have a lot of other contributions beyond economic growth. And also, as I said, that economic growth by itself isn't going to solve all our problems. There's a question from Colin. Hey, Colin. Are there any blue economy certification standards that you've seen gaining traction? Alternatively, are there ocean-friendly frameworks that small and medium enterprises can use to guide the bluing of their operations? So that's really the question. There aren't any sort of blue economy standards yet. I guess like the only parallel would be sort of the eco-labeling or the social labeling that we have, like fair trade coffee or something. There's some like that are starting to come in a little bit in oceans. And as far as the social stuff in oceans, I'll be honest, I don't know if they've come out with any actual labels yet. I know there's been a lot of pushes for transparency along the global supply chain of these big seafood companies. But I don't know that that's resulted in any actual labels yet. I wouldn't be surprised though, but they're probably going to wait until they actually clean up their industry before they come out with a label, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to put the label on themselves. So that may be why it's taking a while. And in terms of the ocean-friendly frameworks, there are a few actually. So off the top of my head, WWF has one. It's called, shoot. Can I send like some links to you guys, and then maybe you can put them up on the page or something? But WWF has one, and it's called it's like investor guidelines for blue economy. It's something like that it's titled. And so it's basically kind of like essentially all the different due diligence steps if you're trying to get a blue economy. If it's like a fishing enterprise or an aquaculture enterprise, this sort of thing. The Nature Conservancy has a similar one. I believe the World Bank has a few, but those are a little bit more high level, to be honest. They're kind of like, they're kind of like very broad guidelines. But the two that I can think of are those by the WWF and the Nature Conservancy. And I apologize, I should know these off the top of my head, but I'll send them to you, Victoria. Or actually, do you have my email? Does everyone have my email? I'll put it in the chat. That's easier.
Yeah, when we put this, we'll put this on our YouTube channel, and we can put, when you send Victoria links too, we can just put those in the comments.
Oh, perfect.
And then that will give people for more information.
Perfect. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Like, it was like getting people's address, like mail something to them. It's like, oh yeah, like you can just email me anytime. And I think that's all the questions that I see.
Yeah.
If no one has any others, I have a last one or another one.
Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about technology. We talked a lot about economic growth and making it just and equitable, and these smaller communities. And even the island states, the South Pacific island states, and all these. Nick asked a question about that earlier. I got a friend down there in Fiji that represents a lot of tribal nations, and but here's one of the pressures that we didn't talk about in the slides. I think you mentioned it once, is ocean mining. So like cobalt and nickel, and this kind of deep sea dredging, so we can build computers and cell phones and batteries for cars, things that support our sustainable energy transformations. What are some things that you think about that? Just curious.
Oof, that one's tough. That one's really tough, and exactly for the reason that you pointed out. So what I will say so the reason I actually don't include it in the sectors that I talked about is actually because I take a pretty hardline view on blue economy as being something that's really new. So to me, like if you're going to come up with a new term and you're saying it's like sustainable and equitable, then every sector in there better be able to be sustainable, right? Because otherwise, then you're just using a new term to talk about the same stuff, right? And so to me, often when I talk about ocean mining, oil and gas, like those are all part of the ocean economy. And that's me, right? So the ocean economy is everything. And so, whereas blue economy is that special subset, right? So to me, when people talk about a sustainable blue economy, it's kind of repeating yourself, right? Because to me, like if you're saying blue economy, it should be sustainable and equitable, right? To take away from what Sid was saying. So that's the reason why I didn't touch on it. But in terms of the ocean economy, 100%, like seabed mining is one of the really big sources of interest, right? And so And actually where I'm from in Guaymas, there's like a really, so Guaymas is on the Gulf of California, if you can picture Mexico, like the Baja, basically, but I'm just like on the mainland side of that coast. There's a big trench in there that happens to have a lot of magnesium nodules or whatever. So there's been a lot of exploration around there. And so what I can say about the mining aspect and oil and gas, actually, no, first let's start with mining. The thing with mining is, remember what I was saying, you have to make sure that you're sustainable right from the get-go, because otherwise it's really hard to scale back. Mining, we're putting the cart way before the horse, right? So you're already starting to see a lot of these concessions being applied for all over the world, and we hardly have the technology to even get down there, let alone make sure that we're doing things sustainably, right? So the idea is like, oh, you know, these robot drill drones were just around the corner, and we're just going to pick up these nodules and everything will be fine, right? So that's kind of the narrative from the industry. The narrative from the people that really know about this stuff, you know, that study deep sea habitats and this sort of thing, is, you know what, we need to immediately stop mining even before it happens, the seabed mining. Right? We need to make sure that we're very, very careful with this sort of thing, because as you mentioned, like the glass sponge reefs that are on here, in any sort of deep sea habitat can take thousands of years to form. You know, so a lot of these people are saying, it's like, wait a minute, like if these things take thousands of years to recover or to reform, if they do, then we can't mess this up with something like seabed mining. You know, and so I think that's kind of the status where it's at now, where it's really kind of on a log jam, you know, because anybody who works in that space is, we absolutely can't proceed with this the way it's being talked about, whereas a lot of the industry is very gung-ho on at least getting those concessions drawn and applied for. Now, like you said, it's part of what powers our daily lives, right? And that's the big conundrum of sort of, you know, like we're all hypocrites in a way, right? Because we know that our computers and the plastics that we use, you know, before the pandemic, I spend most of my time traveling different places around the world on an airplane, right? And so I think that's something that we really need to kind of check ourselves and see what we can do around the edges here. But it's also, I think, important that we not lose sight of the fact that the really, really huge environmental damages that are happening around the world, we're part of that, but there's also a very large system of production in place that's causing it, right? And so us, by our individual actions, we can do a lot, but we actually have to change the whole system if we're really going to get something somewhere meaningful, right? So I think we have to think hard about our individual actions, but we also can't sort of put all the guilt on ourselves either, right? Because then we lose sight of sort of the larger players in all of this. For oil and gas, I was actually having a really, really interesting conversation this morning with a student who's in Newfoundland. And she's looking, you know, as you guys probably know, in Newfoundland, obviously, you know, it's an island, obviously there's a lot of connections to the ocean, but also a lot of recent interest in oil and gas, right? It's sort of something that's going to power their economy. And so she's actually looking at a really interesting way to maybe incorporate it somehow into blue economy. And so her sort of, I guess, argument is that she's still forming, her name's Leah Fusco, is could we have oil and gas, but keep them to some sort of transition plan, right? So could we say, okay, oil and gas, you can be part of the blue economy, but you need to commit to, in 30 years, being fully out of the picture. We're going to use this money in this specific way to put into renewable energy or whatever it may be, right? So in order to make this sustainable. And I thought that was really, really interesting, right? So it's a little bit less hard line than what I've been normally doing, but it may be that that's a little bit more realistic. But I think at the end of the day, like I said before, business as usual isn't working. Like it's gotten to this crazy social ecological mess. And I think we need to start doing something to transform that ASAP. You know, so a lot of this stuff is like, oh, well, maybe in 30 years we'll start to reduce emissions. No, like we need to be starting this 30 years ago, right? And so I think the sooner we can get to it, the better.
I see so many smiles here where you're there's a lot of the choir in the room, Andres. Wait, where we But I do hold you that your students' opinion that transition towards, you taking a resource to build a different resource that pulls us towards something greater. It gives everybody the dignity and the space to retransform. It's not about there shouldn't be businesses. It's just like what is the nature of our businesses and what's the wisdom that we're using. You use the words thinking carefully, but the wisdom sort of falls out of that to me. And we have more knowledge now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially really committing to making that transition happen, right? So not just saying, we'll just make all the money we can from it and, magically renewables will appear. That's not how things have worked, right? We really need to have that commitment.
Okay, wonderful. I think that we are done with questions, and Colin has a big thank you in there. Thanks so much, Colin. I'm going to just quickly share my screen with my PowerPoint. And we were all so excited to get going that we forgot to do our land acknowledgement. So I'm just going to quickly do a land acknowledgement for us here. The Nicholas Sonntag Marine Education Center conducts their work and takes place on the unceded territories of the Squamish peoples and the Squamish Nation, whose connection to these lands continue to this day. When I do land acknowledgements, I really like to reflect on stewardship. And you talked a lot about local interests and local input. And I think that's a huge part of this acknowledgement, is not just recognizing whose lands you are currently occupying, but also how we can connect further and learn that traditional knowledge. So thank you for sharing those perspectives. And then since this is a virtual event, we want to implore all of our participants to research the Indigenous territories that they're currently occupying. So if Graham wants to toss, perfect, he put some resources out there. Some of you probably know this already, but if you are uncertain about whose territories you're currently occupying, you can go to native-land.ca, type in the city that you're in, and you'll learn so much about whose territories and what languages are part of those areas. So we just wanted to quickly finish up that. Sorry, I missed it at the beginning. And then we have a big thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I feel very privileged to have been here and to listen and hear you talk, Andrés. I learned so much, as I always do from these speakers, but I feel extra inspired walking away today with a few ideas of, I don't know, I don't think that the blue economy has ever really been something I've learned about in my studies with environmental work. And so I'm definitely excited to learn more about it and to research it on my own. So thank you for that. And as a big thank you to you, the Nicholas Sonntag Marine Education Center would like to gift you and your family an annual pass to our aquarium. So I know it's COVID times and it's hard.
Don't worry, I'll use it a ton as soon as we get the vaccines.
Yeah, but we will be emailing that to you. And then as soon as it's safe for you all to come over for a visit, we would love for you to do that. So
thank you so much. That really means a lot. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last thing we want to plug here is for folks who attended today, if you want to stay up to date with what we're doing, you can scan this QR code on your phone. You just open up your camera app. It'll take you to this website. You just hold it over and you can sign up to receive our newsletter, which gives you lots of information about our upcoming events, updates about the aquarium and our education programs. And then Graham might be able to put a link to that in the chat too, if that's easier for some folks. But if you have any other questions, you can email me. And Andrés, like we mentioned, if you have any more information you want to send out, I do have everyone's emails, so I can directly email it out after this as well.
Awesome, thanks so much. Yeah, I'll email it to you guys and we can put it up online or whatever's best.
Wonderful. Okay, so I will stop the recording.